Beatrice IMMELMANN, who's actually a colleague of Hannah, she's going to talk about a re-evaluation of Kandinsky's Bauhaus questionnaire on color form correspondences. Yes, all of us know Kandinsky, but apparently he has done some theoretical experimented on the theory of his paintings. The questionnaires have been recently unfolded, and interestingly enough, Beatrice is going to reveal what happened in that questionnaire. A short bio note to Beatrice. As a researcher, Beatrice IMMELMANN is a lecturer at the Department of Art History at Georg-August Göttingen University, where she's focusing on visual culture studies and digital art history. She is pursuing a PhD in art history at the University of Vienna. In her PhD thesis, which is called Visual Resonance, Vibrations in the Context of Perceptual Physiology, Art Theory and Aesthetics, 1700 to 1925, Beatrice investigates the conception of aesthetic experience as a resonance relationship between artist, artwork, and beholder in an art theoretical discourses. She focuses especially on European avant-garde aesthetics. Beatrice had fellowships by the University of Vienna, the German Center for Art History in Paris, and the Vienna Doctoral School in Cognition, Behavior, and Neuroscience. She was also a pre-doc assistant at the research project, which is called Universal Aesthetics of Lines and Colors, ? Effects of Culture, Expertise and Habituation, financed by the Vienna Science and Technology Fund. Okay, the floor is yours. Over to you, Beatrice.
Thank you very much for this really kind introduction. And yeah, Triangles, Lemons, and Canaries, the title of my talk, gathers things who are, according to the artist Wassily Kandinsky, undoubtedly yellow. But while we all probably agree on the yellow color of lemons and canaries, the question of the natural color of an abstract form as the triangle would probably lead to debate. And this exact debate was regularly held at the Bauhaus in Weimar, where Kandinsky started teaching in June 1922. Vincent Weber, a Bauhaus student, explained that, quote, this question was debated and this discussion never came to an end because everyone insisted on his own point of view. As a contribution to this debate, Kandinsky carried out an experimental survey, which was developed and distributed in cooperation with students of the War Painting Workshop in 1923. Participants were instructed to fill in 3 given forms with the primary colors, yellow, red, and blue, and to explain their choice in a short statement, which you can see here. Additionally, they were asked for their name, profession, nationality, and gender. Art historical research mainly focused on only one known completed questionnaire kept at the Bauhaus archive in Berlin, so very few details about the study or its purpose have been known. Kandinsky himself never referred to any results, and we have no record of whether he made any systematic analysis of the answers. However, 26 questionnaires were discovered in the artist's estate in Paris and have only recently been restored and published. In my talk today, I will present an analysis of this unique material, and I will discuss in how far this allows new insights into Kandinsky's theory of abstract art. From about 1904 on, Kandinsky had attempted to characterize the physical and the psychological effect of single colors. He explained psychological effects mainly with color associations that would establish a very specific aesthetic effect. Since, for instance, we've already heard this, yellow is associated with lemons and canaries, the color appears sharp and acute, characteristics which derive from the sour taste, shrill sound, and high pitch of lemons and canaries. These considerations led to the book On the Spiritual in Art, which was published in December 1911. Here, Kandinsky further elaborated different aesthetic effects of different colors and to a lesser extent of form and line on viewers. The title that he had originally planned for the book, Farbensprache, which translates to On the Language of Colors, clearly referred to the communicative potential he ascribed to color effects. Already in 1914, Kandinsky took this theory one step further. He included a figure showing 3 basic forms in 3 primary colors, so a yellow triangle, a blue circle, and a red square, in a published lecture on the spiritual in art. So with this, he posited a direct correspondence between the primary colors, yellow, red, and blue, and the basic forms, triangle, circle, and square, for which the previously established aesthetic effects of colors became his tertium comparationis. So since, for instance, both yellow and the triangle express sharpness, acuity, and a centrifugal movement, they are to Kandinsky corresponding visual elements. A yellow triangle would amplify the aesthetic effect, whereas a triangle in a different color or a different form colored yellow would create discord. In a similar way, blue and a circle are characterized as passive, round, and serene, red and a square as flat and stable. The Bauhaus questionnaire seems to be an attempt to objectify these inductively found analogies. Between 1914 and 1922, Kandinsky was living in Moscow, where he became the chair of the Institute of Artistic Culture. The members of the institute fostered a laboratory atmosphere, and it seems like Kandinsky quickly adjusted to this experimental habitus and tried to adapt it to his previous theoretical considerations. And in a program for the institute, he explicitly focused on this attribution of color and form through parallel aesthetic effects and means of experimentally investigating them. I quote, "The effect of these simple forms is investigated by collating specific information from questionnaires and from interviewing people. They will try to describe their sensations by every means possible. They will, for example, look for parallel impressions in sounds of different musical instruments. At first, we combine elementary colors with simple geometrical forms. Yellow, red, and blue are introduced in all their combinations into the triangle, the square, and the circle." And in a first draft for such a questionnaire, he planned to ask participants about parallel sensations to associate color and form. For example, I quote again, "How do you see a triangle? Is not the sensation elicited by a triangle more similar to that elicited by a lemon? What is the singing of a canary more like, a triangle or a square?" Obviously, I'm showing you the first questionnaire. Obviously, Kandinsky rather tried to induce his own sensations, but still, his initial search for physical and psychological effect seems to have evolved into a general interest for empirically grounded art theory. The information on the Bauhaus questionnaires now allows us to conclude that Kandinsky and his workshop used a select sampling of Bauhaus personnel, and most of the participants were students or employees in various Bauhaus workshops. 8 participants had enrolled in 1923 and might have known Kandinsky's theory from his course for first semester students. However, none of these groups notably shared opinions on the corresponding elements, so I'm not going into detail here. Unfortunately, we still do not possess conclusive information about details of the study design, But considering the variety of writing materials, like you can see here, and color pigments, including watercolor and crayon and different hues, we were able to differentiate at least 5 different yellow tones, 7 different red tones, and 7 different blue tones. It seems likely that the survey did not take place at a single site and or date. And yeah, for these 27 questionnaires, we calculated the frequency of relating specific colors with specific forms and analyzed the statements given by the participants. And just by counting the single attributions, the results show that most participants shared the correspondence of the color yellow with the form of the triangle. However, there's no obvious tendency to attribute the square or the circle with the colors red or blue. We found 12 assignments for the association suggested by Kandinsky, 8 assignments for the association of a red circle, a blue square, and a yellow triangle, which was promoted by Kandinsky's colleague, the artist Oskar Schlemmer, and 7 assignments for a red triangle, a yellow circle, and a blue square, which to the best of our knowledge was not specifically theorized by any Bauhaus member. Thus, the attribution suggested by Kandinsky was the preferred one, but still less than half of the participants chose the correspondences he had promoted. It is, however, remarkable that none of the participants assigned blue to the triangle or yellow to the square, and hence these 3 groups, these 3 possible orders were not chosen at all. Of these 27 participants, 20 provided elaborate statements, which leaves us with 10, 4, and 6 statements in these 3 groups for a qualitative analysis. And we coded the main argument within these groups, and interestingly, for all of them, the prevailing criterion was the parallel aesthetic effect of color and form. In the first group, 9 participants argued that the concentric circular movement or enclosed calm form of the color blue justified their decision to attribute it to the circle. 8 participants agreed that the red is a stable and static color, or that it remains on the surface, just like the square. In the second group, 2 participants agreed with the previous group that the circle needs a color with circular movement, but found this appropriate to red. 3 people agreed with the previous group concerning the stable character of the square, but attributed these qualities to blue. Both groups agreed that the radiating on the connection of yellow and the triangle, and in these 2 groups, 11 out of 14 participants agreed on the radiating, eccentric, sharp, and acute character of the color yellow and the triangle. In the third group, participants largely agreed on the effects of the 3 colors indicated by the other 2 groups, but attributed them to different forms. Only the arguments in favor of a red triangle shows no pattern. So even though the results of the study were not as clear as Kandinsky probably had hoped, the correspondences he favored were still confirmed, and this was also acknowledged by Oskar Schlemmer. But intuitively, one would still, of course, not expect that Kandinsky actually discovered something like a universal law of color effects. After all, this was the color theory that he and Schlemmer taught, so the participants were surely biased. The results were consequently refuted by recent psychological studies. As you can see, the fact that an artist actually conducted an experimental study on the question of color-form correspondences became an object of fascination in psychological empirical aesthetics. But in all these studies, Kandinsky's assignments often turned out to be the least preferred if participants did not have explicit knowledge of his theory. Color-form correspondences are obviously culturally dependent. Japanese participants, for example, mostly assigned the circle to red, which was explained by the authors with associations with the Japanese flag that was shown in these two studies, for example, in Europe, but also in Vanuatu, where Sebastian Walter replicated the study. The circle was mostly assigned to the color yellow, possibly because of associations with the sun. But an analysis of the historical data still allows us to get a better picture of what the empirical study of color effects by an artist actually stands for. A reduced color palette and a concentration on elementary form had been discussed at the Bauhaus prior to Kandinsky's arrival, and by 1923 had become an important aspect of the Bauhaus, Bauhaus design. On the occasion of the exhibition Kunst und Technik, eine neue Einheit in summer 1923, so shortly before the questionnaire was distributed, Herbert Bayer designed a staircase of the Bauhaus building using circular forms and the color blue on the ground floor, squares and red on the first floor, and yellow and triangles on the second floor. And this is a photography of a reconstruction and how it looks today. By a staircase led to the exhibition floor, so all Bauhaus affiliates who responded to the questionnaire eventually were confronted with these correspondences in the building. Additionally, the anthology Staatliches Bauhaus Weimar from 1923 included a reproduction of the figure from 1914. But testimonies of Bauhaus affiliates prove that such correspondences were not only taught, but also regularly discussed. The silversmith Gyula Papp remembered the existence of a working group with Paul Klee, Kandinsky, Schlemmer, and other Bauhaus members who all tried to clarify which color corresponds to which form. Papp reported that he took part once when the discussion focused on yellow, and that he argued that silver corresponds to the circle and the color blue, as all are pliant. Brass is hard and sharp and corresponds to the triangle. Copper is clumsy and heavy and therefore corresponds to the square and the color red. So Papp used parallel aesthetic effects to argue such correspondences, but he adapted them and included the materials he knew from his personal experience at the metal workshop. And I think this statement is really telling in the context of Bauhaus pedagogy and of Kandinsky's color theory. So the search for such cross-modal analogies or associations and the actual debate about the underlying rationalizations were obviously a pivotal aspect of Bauhaus' reform of art education. And this reform explicitly fostered perceptual sensitization, which can be understood as a demand to sense the relation among colors, forms, but also sounds and materials and many more, as Walter Gropius put it in 1923. The participants' statements from the questionnaires therefore clearly mirror this specific analytical approach to colors and forms at the Bauhaus. But on the other side, the subjective and thus differing effects of colors, lines, and forms did a main argument against abstract art and contemporary art criticism. A letter from the art historian Max Deri in Kandinsky's estate suggests that Kandinsky's interest in a psychologically informed science of art started to grow around 1912. Deri was a student of Heinrich Wölfflin, but was also an autodidact of psychology. He had published the essay Kunstpsychologische Untersuchungen, which translates to Investigations into the Psychology of Art, in January and April 1912, with the aim to establish an objective approach to art. For this, he focused on an analysis of the viewer's aesthetic experience and the question of whether experience is in accordance with the artist's intention. The communication or the understandability of the effects of artistic means was therefore a fundamental problem in Deri's, but also in Kandinsky's theory. To give an example, Deri assumed that the difference between two S-shaped lines can be differentiated by calling one happier and one sadder, and that, quote, one can draw an audacious, defined, sad, striving line. Interestingly, an almost identical list can be found in Kandinsky's article über die Formfrage, published in the Blue Rider Almanac in May 1912. He writes that the general appearance of the differently curved lines of a character can be gay, sad, striving, sinking, defined, ostentatious. In the letter, Deri refers to a manuscript, which is probably his book on painting in the 19th century. Here, he devoted 20 pages to a very positive analysis of Kandinsky's oeuvre, but he did not assume that viewers would be able to understand his art. As an example, Deri considers the viewer's gaze on the troika motif, which is prominent in Kandinsky's artworks of the time. You can see one here in the three primary colors. And he assumed that the lines would be viewed by starting at the thickened end in opposition to Kandinsky's intentions, and therefore would be misunderstood. While Kandinsky, according to Deri, wanted to achieve a concentration of force and for the viewer to feel an assault, the observer instead experiences a harmonious dissolution of form and a feeling of conciliation. Deri thus seems to suggest that Kandinsky had failed in the communication of aesthetic effect. And I think that Deri here expresses a typical argument against Kandinsky's abstract art in contemporary criticism. He doubted that the art can keep the promises from the theory in regard to aesthetic effect of color, line, and form on a beholder. And Kandinsky's interest in the science of art seems to be rooted in this problematization of communicating aesthetic effect. Empirical research, therefore, has to be understood as an analytical precondition for abstract art on the lowest level, since it was considered a tool to assess generally valid knowledge of aesthetic effects that could then be reproduced in painting. The questionnaires therefore represent the paradox of Kandinsky's theory. While he obviously aspired objective knowledge of color effects to employ them in abstract art, experience showed that color associations were considered to be highly relative, unstable, and individual, and it was therefore impossible to establish shared aesthetic principles based on color association. In his own artistic practice, Kandinsky held on to introspective and unconscious methodologies anyway. In an interview with the psychologist Paul Plaut in 1922, he stated that in the conception of an artwork, one could, of course, produce something warm, cold, radiant, or restrained. But he concluded, I quote, "Maybe sadly, maybe luckily, I don't work that way." And I would like to conclude with this quote. Thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to the wonderful organizing committee and to all participants for making this conference possible in such challenging times.